Well, this weekend will mark the 5th anniversary of Stephen Harper's first election victory. How have those 5 years changed Canada, and how have they changed the man himself? Late last week, the Prime Minister sat down to try to answer those questions and more. Tonight, part 1 of our interview. Prime Minister, I guess I should start with a congratulations in a couple of days. 5 years since you first won office. But it's actually, more than that in the sense that it's 5 years, almost to the day,
right.
That you will have been leading minority government in Canada. No other Prime Minister has gone that long. I think you now edge out Lester Pearson. Does that mean something to you?
I think it's I think it's just an interesting statistic. The minority parliament's been interesting. I think we've demonstrated that it can work. It hasn't always been pretty. We don't get done everything we want to get done, or sometimes I think we need to get done. But I think for the most part, considering what could have happened, it served Canadians fairly well.
A couple of years ago you told me that you thought that Canada may be in for a period of minority government, a series of minority governments. Do you still feel that way?
It's possible, although you're probably aware of my take on where we're headed in the next Parliament. I think we saw forewarning of that in this Parliament. I think the next time our party will either form a majority, or I think we'll see a coalition of the other parties. That's my belief. Everything I see points to that. I, of course, would always be happy to, if people of Canada elect a Conservative minority, I'd be happy to do that. But my anticipation is that we'll go one way or the other next time.
Whenever you talk that way about the other parties forming a coalition, you tend to do it in a pretty negative way, and almost that it's somehow it's kind of undemocratic to have a coalition. Yeah. I mean, there are coalitions in Western democracies, including your friend David Cameron.
Of course, but I think and David Cameron is an interesting example, because they had that debate there, and what I think public concluded was undemocratic and not really legitimate was a coalition of parties who lost an election. Mr. Cameron won the election and then was able to form a coalition. I think really that's the issue. I think if coalition is part of what the public was prepared to vote for, but I think when it's a coalition that is seeming to overturn the result of the election, I think that's when the public have a big problem with that.
When you look across Western democracies, there are a lot of minority governments out there. I mean, one, I suppose, could even argue that the Americans are now in a kind of minority situation.
Well, I think you could argue the American system makes the president a perpetual minority in some ways.
But I mean, what's happening out there that we seem to be in this period of, in some ways, of division in the sense of forming governments? That there's a kind of solid core on either side that leads towards minority.
Well, I'm not sure you can generalize like that, Peter. I think, in Canada, I think the reasons are unique. I think it's not a secret. The presence of strong third parties, in particular the Bloc Québécois, continued presence in Quebec, has made the math for majority government very difficult for anybody. I think, different circumstance in Britain. In most of the continental European countries, typically minority governments follow from their electoral system. France actually has a majority because they've made changes along those lines. So I think it's hard to generalize. I think what we can say that would be true, Peter, is that we know the globe is in challenging economic times, and obviously in those kinds of times, people search for different answers, and people sometimes coalesce strongly around certain ideas and certain parties, and at the same time they often start to look for new options.
I want to talk a little bit about the 5 years, because I think it's interesting to try and sense how the country's changed, how you've changed in those 5 years, and especially in terms of your thinking towards government itself.
Right.
I think it's common for most people to assume they'd feel a certain way if they had such and such a job, and then perhaps feel a little differently when they're in it. So I've been doing a little reading.
Okay.
And I found a few of the things that you've said over the past few years. In a couple of years before you were elected as Prime Minister, you wrote an op-ed piece when you were asked, what do you think of the federal government? What needs to change? And you were pretty critical of the federal government, not just from a partisan way, but from a structural way, that things had to change. You felt that Ottawa was elitist and too centrist in its structure. But you also had this line: the federal government doesn't do anything particularly well except collect money from political opponents and shower it on political supporters.
Right.
Well, it's pretty tough talk, but yeah, I mean, that's one thing when you're outside. You've been running that same federal government for 5 years. Do you still look at it that way?
Well, I think we've changed a lot of things, Peter, and I won't say that one sees things differently as Prime Minister or leader of the opposition private citizen. I'm not going to deny that, but I think we've changed some things. I mean, one of the first things we brought in was the Federal Accountability Act, a series of measures. We changed the whole structure of donations and financing of political parties. We brought in new rules on lobbying. And I'm not going to say that we run a perfect government by any means, but there have been no corruption scandals or anything resembling that under this government. You look at Canada.
But does nothing? No, but does nothing particularly well?
Look at Canada's economic action plan. We had a series of things under the previous government. You remember HRSD, sponsorship scandals. It seemed like a series of boondoggles, either corruption or incompetency scandals. And once again, not claiming we're perfect, but look at the economic action plan. I mean, we got the federal bureaucracy, the senior public servants, who deserve a lot of credit for the success in rolling that out. We got them finding ways to reduce approval processes, to work constructively with provinces and municipalities on identifying priorities, and to get projects up and running and rolled out in record time. So I do think we've changed some of the things. Obviously that's a leader of the opposition speaking, but I do think the performance of the federal government as an institution has been significantly better in the last few years than it was before.
The day you won office as leader of the Conservative Party,
the new party.
Speech you made at the new party, the speech you made at that convention in 2004, you said, we can create a country built on solid conservative values,
not on expensive liberal promises. A country the Liberals wouldn't even recognize, the kind of country I want to lead.
Is that what you think you've created so far?
Well, I think, the country's moving in the right direction. Look, Peter, here's the big picture. 5 years ago, at best, we were in the middle of the pack in advanced countries. Today, if you look at most performance indicators, we're at the top, and in a challenging economic time. Now, obviously, the challenging economic time is the big reality, but I think in many ways it's like business. Everybody makes money when times are good. It's when times are not so good that the groundwork is laid for the next generation. I think we're doing that. I think, notwithstanding all the challenges that continue to be with us, I think we've done most of the right things on the economy. We're coming out of this recession. We have to keep working with our global partners, but we're coming out in pretty good shape. And I think we've got a generation of tremendous opportunity moving forward for this country.
There are those who criticize you as sort of a one-man band, that you run everything, and that your ministers are often kind of yes people. To you.
In terms of that particular criticism, Peter, I mean, you've been around long enough. Every prime minister who's been in charge, whether it's all across the spectrum, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Mulroney, Mr. Chrétien, every prime minister is accused of being a one-man band, because the reality, the prime minister is the chief executive officer of our government. The prime minister does not sit in his office and just do things off the top of his head. It's part of leading a team and figuring out what the consensus is of that team in almost every case. There are, of course, exceptions where the Prime Minister will say, we've got to go this way, regardless of maybe some other views. But those are pretty rare.
Last year, when we talked about this time, when you were approaching the 4th anniversary, I asked you how you personally had changed. And your answer at that time was that you felt you were more patient, that you were less partisan, and less sensitive about criticism from others. What would you add to that?
It's funny. I thought you might ask me that question. I did think I don't go around thinking about it every day. I did think about it some more, and I'm not sure I'd add a lot to it. I think all of those things are true. I think part of what happens, Peter, when you're in government. I remember when I was in opposition, people who had been in government used to say to me, the worst day in government's better than the best day in opposition. And it sounded to me like a bunch of propaganda, to be honest. But I actually think it's true. And the longer you're in government, the more you value what you do in government. The ability to try and tackle problems, set an agenda, have some accomplishments. So the longer, frankly, you're in government, the more I think you become absorbed in what it is government's doing or can be doing. And frankly, the more you tend to see the partisan and electoral game as a distraction. Now, you know, in a minority government, you can't afford to see as a distraction for very long because it's always there. But I think that's what does happen. I think it's probably a natural evolution. Other things happen, of course. You get a bit grayer, and but I do think what I said last year is probably essentially true. I think also you get the more time you're in government, you get constantly a deeper appreciation of complexity of issues, of the complexity of viewpoints, of the value, whether you agree with it or not, of the range of opinion that exists among Canadians.
Well, you know, some of your kind of ardent supporters in the conservative wing of your party would say that you've become not only less partisan and less sensitive, but you've become, to criticism, but less conservative. Is that fair?
No, I think if you look on balance, I think this is a government. This is a center-right government. I don't think the fundamentals of our values are very different. I think we're clear about these things. We tend to favor free enterprise and markets over government intervention, low taxes over high taxes. We favor family tradition. We're strong supporters of our traditional allies. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to identify the values we fundamentally stand for. If you were to say all those things considered, we see some pretty different policies in the last couple of years or over the 5 years. Well, the answer to that, Peter, is of course. I mean, fundamentally, being a conservative is about being a political realist. And one's policies have to be appropriate. We've done, as no secret, we've done these big economic stimulus measures. We've had large-scale direct government spending, running some deficits in the past couple of years, because everything I know about the economy tells me that's the appropriate policy under the extremely unusual circumstances we found ourselves in. You don't stand up and do a policy that's inappropriate because somebody says that it's not their dictionary definition of conservatism. But I think we've done it in a way that is consistent with our views and consistent with the promotion of the kind of Canada we want to see over time.
Well, you know who Jerry Nichols is because you worked with him at the National Citizens Coalition. This is what he wrote just the other day. Stephen Harper has essentially thrown economic conservatives under the bus. During his term in office, he's engaged in spending sprees, chalked up enormous deficits, increased the size and scope of government, even embraced Trudeau-style economic nationalism. Now, you just addressed some of that in terms of the stimulus spending.
I just think that's first of all, that's not only untrue, but is completely unrepresentative of economic conservatives, Peter, and people who see themselves on the center right, particularly on economic issues, are overwhelmingly. In fact, I bet a pollster would tell you they're 95, 100% supportive of this government because they know that we're doing what is necessary in the economic circumstances while maintaining our long-term approach, which is to keep taxes down and make sure that future growth is in a free enterprise in the private and free enterprise sector. That's what this government is doing. In fact, I think the opposite is arguable. I think the realism here, Peter, is not against some abstract. I mean, we're political realist conservatives. We don't compare ourselves to some abstract ideology. The real comparison is what is being done in other countries. I think arguably we are running right now the most free enterprise government in the developed world. I think that's very arguable. We're one of the few countries reducing our taxes. We are, even with our deficits and debt, we're at some of the lowest levels in the developed world in these areas. So, one has to compare oneself to reality, not to some abstract here.
Somebody, I don't know whether Nichols himself would say this, but some would argue that you've taken the positions you've taken because you're in minority, that if you were in a majority position, you wouldn't have had as extensive a stimulus program as you did, and some of the other decisions wouldn't have been taken because You would have been in a majority position.
No, we've taken the positions, Peter, because they're the right positions for the economy. There's lots of things we've been pressured to do in this minority government that we've refused to do. We have refused to permanently increase the size and generosity of the employment insurance program. The opposition parties unanimously have passed motions saying that we should institute effectively a 45-day work year under EI, using the recession as the pretext. They've said that we should hike taxes again across the board. Most recently, of course, they're calling for us to hike business taxes back up, to hike sales taxes back up. They all called on us, by the way, to have much bigger stimulus programs than we had. Of course, no matter what we spent, they would say spend more. We took the positions we took because they're affordable and they're the right thing to do. We didn't, Peter, use this as an excuse to create permanent new programs. We didn't use this as an excuse to create, or we didn't choose the method of creating whole new bureaucracies to deliver stimulus programs. What we did is we went principally to other levels of government. We said, what are your existing capital expenditure plans that the economy is going to need anyway? And let's prioritize those, fund them now, and bring them forward in the economy now so we need them. I think it's good economics, long term. And I say very different than the approach used elsewhere, and will not expand the role of government long term, but will assess the recovery.
But does it expand the role of government? I mean, you look at the statistics, and the size of government has grown considerably in the 5 years that you've been Prime Minister, something like 11, 12%.
Well,
in terms of the number of employees. Understand the money issue because of the stimulus program, right or wrong, you would get that, but the size of government has grown.
No, but I think, Peter, you have to look at where some of these increases have been. You know, for example, this government has been expanding the size of the military. We said we would rebuild the armed forces. We said we've expanded, we've hired more police officers. These are roles for government that Conservatives believe very strongly in, and we've increased employment in those areas. Another area, we've had problems in this country, as you know, with inadequate product and consumer safety laws and inadequate powers of inspection. So we've bolstered capacities in those areas. Now, are you telling me that going forward, especially as we're reducing our deficit, that there's areas where we could streamline operations? I think absolutely, that's true. Well, but I don't think it's just the case you say that government's bigger, therefore it's gone in a different direction. I think we're spending in the areas we need to be spending on. And I think if you look at the trend size of government with the recovery, it's not growing in this country.